Chapter 1. The Man the Rain Brought. The rain had been falling since before Nora woke. She could hear it before she opened her eyes, steady and heavy against the tin roof of the cottage. The kind of rain that turned the gravel path into a small river and flooded the hollow where the old willow stood. She had lived in Ashford Creek for 3 years, and still the winters here felt like punishment. The kind of cold that came up through the floorboards and settled into your joints. The kind of dark that pressed against every window, as though it had business inside. She pulled her rope tight and put the kettle on. Nora Vesper was 24 years old, ran a second-hand bookshop out of the cottage's front room, and had exactly 2 friends in the town. Della, who worked at the pharmacy and talked too fast, and Marcus, who drove the post van and barely talked at all. She had come to Ashford Creek because she needed somewhere quiet to finish grieving, and instead found herself simply staying. The grief softening slowly into something that only ached on rainy mornings like this one. She didn't believe in fate. She would remember that about herself. Later, she would remember standing at the kitchen window watching water pour off the eaves, steam rising from her mug, completely certain that her life was small and deliberate and entirely within her control. Then the knocking began. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the knock of someone using the last of what they had. 3 blows, slow, like falling stones. Nora set her mug down and frowned at the door. It was barely 6 in the morning. The road outside was empty. Nobody came up the hill before noon. She opened the door. The man on her step was enormous. That was the first thing she registered. Not the blood, not the way he was holding his side, not the torn state of his clothing or the rain plastering dark hair to his forehead. Just his sheer size. He was built like something that had grown up outdoors, broad through the shoulder, tall enough that the doorframe nearly clipped him, and he was barely upright. One hand braced against the doorframe. The other pressed to a wound along his ribs that had soaked through a shirt the color of charcoal and turned it black. His eyes found hers. Gray. Almost silver. Cold as winter water, even now, even with his body clearly failing him, and that was the second thing she registered, the coldness in those eyes. Not cruelty, not menace exactly. Something more like a man who had learned that warmth was a liability and had sealed it away somewhere no one could reach it. He looked at her like she was a variable he hadn't accounted for. He started, and then he went down. Not slowly, not dramatically. He simply stopped holding himself up and dropped. One knee hitting the step hard enough that Nora heard it, and she moved without thinking, grabbing his arm, bracing under his weight, doing absolutely nothing to stop his descent because he was at least 100 pounds heavier than her. They ended up in an undignified heap half on the threshold, rain soaking the back of his jacket, her knee jammed against the doorframe, his forehead nearly against her shoulder. "Oh, 4," she said. It took her 10 minutes to get him inside. She couldn't lift him. She could only brace and redirect, guiding more than carrying, and he was semi-conscious enough to do some of the work, crawling more than walking across her floor and collapsing onto the old sofa by the fireplace like a shipwreck reaching shore. She shoved a cushion under his head, pulled the throw blanket down from the back of the chair, and crouched beside him to look at the wound. It was bad. Not in an immediately fatal way. The bleeding had slowed, which meant something important hadn't been punctured, but it was deep and ragged and entirely the wrong shape for any ordinary injury. It looked, she thought, with a crawl in the knees, like something had clawed him. Not an animal. Not an animal. Claws, longer than any she could name, and in a pattern that made her stomach turn. She pressed a folded towel against it. He hissed and his hand came up instinctively, closing around her wrist, and she stopped breathing. His grip was impossibly strong. Not painful, not threatening, just absolute, like being caught by something that didn't know its own power. His eyes opened and fixed on her again. That strange silver gray, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he let go. "Sorry," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel underwater. "It's fine," she said, because her heart was slamming and she needed to say something ordinary. "You've been clawed. Do you want to tell me what did it, or should I just guess?" He closed his eyes. "Bear. There are no bears in Ashford Creek. There was tonight." She looked at him for a long moment. His breathing was steadying, the tension in his jaw easing, despite the size of him, despite the wound, and the rain, and the impossible manner of his arrival. There was something in his stillness that was almost peaceful, the stillness of a creature that was used to enduring. "What's your name?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he'd passed out again. Then, Cassian. Just the one word. No surname offered. No explanation. No apology for collapsing on her doorstep at 6 a.m. with a wound that would need stitches. He said his name like it was all she was going to get. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at the fire she'd lit, already catching. The rain was getting louder. Outside, the road was a river. He wasn't going anywhere tonight, and she couldn't reach anyone in this weather. And somehow she knew, with a certainty that had no logical basis, the kind of knowing that lives in the body before the mind catches up, that this man had not arrived at her door by accident. She had told herself for 3 years that she didn't believe in fate. She was already beginning to suspect it didn't particularly care. She got up, went to the bathroom, and found her first aid kit. She didn't ask herself why she wasn't afraid. She didn't examine the way the cold room felt different with him in it. Warmer somehow, despite the draft. Like a fire that didn't need tending. She didn't question the fact that when she returned to the sofa, he was watching her. Not with suspicion or hunger or any of the things she might have expected from a stranger bleeding in her house. He was watching her the way someone watches a place they once knew and thought they'd lost. She would think about that look for a long time afterward. She would never fully understand it, not until she understood what she was. Chapter 2. The Weight of Silver. He was still there in the morning. Nora had half expected him not to be. She had spent the night on the armchair across from the sofa, dozing in 20-minute stretches, waking each time to check the wound and find it, inexplicably, worryingly, looking better than it had before. By 4 a.m, the edges had begun to close in a way that made her think she had miscalculated the severity. By dawn, the wound that should have needed stitches looked 3 days old. She sat in the gray, early light and watched him sleep and felt the first real thread of unease work its way through her. Normal people didn't heal like that. He woke just before 7, no slow surfacing. One moment he was asleep. The next, those silver eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling, and he took 2 measured breaths before he sat up, like a soldier, like a man who had learned to be conscious quickly. He looked at her across the room. "You stayed up," he said. "You were bleeding on my sofa." It seemed irresponsible to sleep. Something shifted in his expression, not quite warmth, but a softening, as though she had said something that surprised him by being reasonable. He looked down at his side, pulled the hem of his shirt up slightly, studied the wound with that same clinical detachment. "It looks better," Nora said carefully. "Yes. Wounds don't usually do that." "No?" She waited. He didn't offer anything else, just pulled his shirt back down and looked at the fire, which had burned to embers, and sat there with the particular stillness of someone who was choosing every word before it left his mouth. "You should eat something," she said, because she needed to move, needed to not sit there watching him decide whether to tell her the truth. She went to the kitchen and he didn't follow her, and she stood at the counter for a moment, pressing her fingertips to the wood, breathing. Clawed by a bear. In the dark, on a road that led only to her cottage and, further along, to the forest edge. She made eggs. She brought 2 plates out because the alternative was eating alone, while a stranger who had healed overnight sat in her living room, and that felt more unsettling than company. He took the plate with both hands, careful, like he was remembering how to do something ordinary. "I'll be gone today," he said, "once the road clears." "You don't have to, I know." He looked up from the plate. "I should go." There was something in the way he said should that caught at her. Not will, not need to. Should. A word that carried the weight of a decision that had already been argued out somewhere private and was being stated now as a fact to prevent further negotiation. "Is someone looking for you?" she asked. The pause was just long enough to mean yes. Probably. The thing that clawed you. He was quiet. Outside, the rain had eased to a thin gray drizzle, and the morning light was the color of old silver, and Nora thought, "I have asked him 2 direct questions and he has answered neither of them." She thought, "He is eating the eggs I made him, and he looks like a man sitting in a church, like something about this ordinary kitchen is unbearable to him." "Cassian," she said. He looked at her when she said his name. fully, completely, the way he hadn't quite done before, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest like a struck chord, a resonance she didn't have language for. Something pulled taut between them in the quiet, some invisible line going tense. He looked away first. "The thing that found me," he said carefully, "is not something you should ask about." "Why?" "Because the more you know about it, the more reason it has to come here." Nora set her fork down. "Then why are you here? If knowing you brings danger, why come to my door?" He didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened. She had the sense of watching someone choose between two versions of the truth and find neither of them adequate. "I didn't choose your door," he said at last. I followed something. A pull. I don't know how else to say it. I was losing blood and I followed something I couldn't explain and it led here." She looked at him. "And before you say that's impossible," he added quietly, without looking up from his plate, "I am aware that it is." The pull. She turned the word over. She shouldn't have known what he meant. She was a woman who ran a second-hand bookshop in a small town in the middle of nowhere, who had no particular gifts and no unusual history, whose most unusual trait was perhaps an extremely good memory for the plots of novels she had read only once. She shouldn't have known what he meant. But she thought of the night before, the moment she'd opened the door and the cold air had hit her, and she'd seen him standing there enormous and ruined and barely upright, and the thought that had moved through her before fear or sense could interrupt it, like something spoken in a language she hadn't known she understood. There you are. She hadn't examined that thought. She had immediately buried it under logistics and practicality, and the immediate problem of his wound. She looked at it now. "How long have you been running?" she asked. He glanced up. "From whatever is following you," she clarified. "How long?" Something in his face shifted. Not surprise. He didn't seem like a man who's surprised easily. More like recognition. Like she had stepped closer to something than he expected. 3 weeks, he said. She nodded slowly. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't ask why. She only said, "There's a room at the back with a proper bed. The road won't clear until afternoon at the earliest." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I shouldn't stay." "I know you think that," Nora said, and picked up her fork again. "But you're going to." She didn't look up to see his expression. She didn't need to. She heard him exhale, slow and careful, like a man setting down something very heavy. And she heard underneath that, the particular silence of someone who has stopped arguing with something they knew was inevitable. The morning settled around them like snow. Outside, the drizzle continued. The road stayed flooded, and somewhere in the tree line at the edge of town, where the old growth began and the light never quite reached, something moved through the fog on 4 feet and stopped and lifted its head and was still. Chapter 3. What the body knows. He stayed 2 days. He had said he would leave that afternoon, and then the road hadn't cleared, and then evening had come, and somewhere in the quiet negotiation of those hours it became simply understood that he was staying the night. She made up the back room. She didn't ask questions. He helped her carry firewood from the lean-to without being asked, and didn't speak while he did it, and she found, to her own confusion, that his silence was not uncomfortable. It had texture to it, substance, the silence of someone who was used to being alone and had learned to make it livable. The second morning he was gone from the room when she woke, and her heart did something strange before she found him in the kitchen, standing at the counter with his back to her, making coffee with the precise movements of a man who had studied the procedure once and memorized it completely. He handed her a cup when she came in, without turning around, without asking how she took it. It was exactly right. She stood there holding the cup, and the morning light came through the window and landed on the side of his face, and she thought, "This is dangerous." Not dangerous the way she had thought last night, when she'd lain awake trying to reason out who he might be and what had wounded him. Dangerous the way a fire is dangerous, the kind of danger you move toward without meaning to, because warmth is its own gravity. "You found the coffee," she said. "I hope that's all right." "It's fine." She sat at the table. He stayed at the counter. Some careful geometry had been established between them over the past 36 hours, an unspoken mapping of how close was too close, where to stand, when to look and when not to. She was aware of it even as she pretended she wasn't. "How's the side?" "Almost healed." "You said that yesterday." It was true yesterday. She watched him over the rim of her cup. He had borrowed one of the oversized flannels she kept by the back door, and it was slightly too short in the sleeves, and she found herself noticing his hands, wide, scarred. The kind of hands that knew outdoor work, and yet there was something almost careful about how he used them. Like a large animal that has learned to navigate small spaces. Cassian, she said. He turned, just slightly. Waiting. The thing in the forest. She set her cup down. I need to know what it is. The silence that followed was different from his usual kind. This one had edges. Why? He asked. Because it came within 50 meters of my house 2 nights ago. I could hear it. She watched his jaw tighten. I don't know what I was listening to, but I know it was alive, and I know it was large, and I know you know exactly what it is. He turned fully, leaned back against the counter and crossed his arms over his chest, which she had noticed was a posture he used when he was deciding something. Not defensiveness, calculation. As though his arms were a wall he was building brick by brick while he figured out how much to let through. What did you hear? He asked. Movement. Heavy. Circling the tree line. She paused, and a sound I don't have a word for, low. Like it was communicating. Something moved across his face, there and gone, fast as a weather change. Communicating with what? I don't know. She held his gaze. With you? With me? I don't know. He was very still. Nora, he said. Her name in his mouth was odd, not unpleasant. Strange, like hearing a word in your own language spoken by someone who learned it somewhere else, from someone else, in a different context. It sounded, somehow, like a word he had been holding for a long time. There are things I can't explain to you here. Things that would. He stopped, started again. Things that would change how you see everything. They already are, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something behind the silver of his eyes that she couldn't name. Not quite pain, not quite longing. Something older than either of those things. I belong to a place, he said finally, before I came here. A community. There are rules, there. Old ones. I broke one of them. Not through cruelty. Through. I thought I was protecting someone. His voice stayed flat and even, each word placed with the care of someone reconstructing a collapse. The community sent a tracker. That's what you heard in the forest. That's what wounded me. Nora processed this. A tracker. Yes. A tracker. Yes. A person? Another pause. Shorter than the last. Not exactly. She sat very still. Outside, a bird moved through the bare branches of the ash tree, and the morning shifted around them, ordinary and unchanged. And Nora felt she didn't know how to put it. She felt the ordinary world thin slightly, like a paper held up to light, all the known shapes suddenly showing what was beneath them. Not a bear, she said. No. You knew I knew that. Yes. She exhaled. And the thing you did, the rule you broke, does it have something to do with me? She hadn't planned to ask it. The question arrived from somewhere she hadn't been monitoring and was out before she could weigh it, and she watched it land in the space between them and watched him go very, very still. What made you ask that? He said. You said you followed a pole. To my door specifically. She kept her voice steady. I'm asking if that's a coincidence. He looked at her for a long time. The morning was fully bright now, winter thin and pale, and in that light she could see the full structure of his face. Not handsome exactly, but striking. Built from sharp lines and controlled emotion, the face of a man who had learned to make himself unreadable and had perhaps forgotten how to stop. No, he said. It isn't a coincidence. The word landed in her chest like a dropped stone. She watched the ripples move through her and didn't try to stop them. Tell me, she said. He uncrossed his arms. For a moment, he just stood there in the borrowed flannel with the morning light on him and his hands at his sides, and she thought, he is trying to decide how to destroy something. She thought, he has been here before, standing in front of someone with a truth too large to hand over gently. Not yet, he said. When you know, you can't unknow it. His eyes held hers. Steady, certain. And once you know, everything changes. So I am asking you, not to be evasive, but because I believe you deserve the choice to wait until you're ready. Nora looked at him. That's very considerate, she said. For someone who collapsed on my doorstep without asking. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Something adjacent to it. The ghost of one. It changed his face completely, and she felt it hit her somewhere she was not prepared for. She looked back at her coffee. Fine, she said, but I'm not patient. I know, he said softly. She looked up. I can tell, he added, and something in the way he said it made her think he meant it not as a recent observation, but as a much older one. Chapter 4. The name in the old books. She found the name on the third day, by accident. The way all important things seemed to arrive. Cassian had gone out walking. He did this at dusk, always, coming back an hour later smelling of pine and cold air with his expression slightly less guarded than when he left. Like whatever he did in the forest served the same function as other people's silence. She had stopped asking where he went. She had also, she noted with some concern, stopped finding it strange that she no longer asked. She was cataloging the back room of the shop, boxes she hadn't opened since she'd moved in, old stock she'd inherited from the previous owner along with the lease, mostly paperbacks, a few cloth-bound things. One box sealed with actual wax that she'd been meaning to open for 3 years and kept putting off because something about it felt like it should be opened properly, with intention, not just on a slow Tuesday. Tonight was a slow Tuesday. She broke the seal. Inside, letters she couldn't read, bound with black thread. A small glass bottle of something dark and crystallized. A map she didn't recognize. The landscape had no name she knew, and the borders were drawn not in roads, but in trees and water and something else. A third line that ran parallel to the rivers and was marked only with small crescent shapes, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a book. The cover read, in faded silver lettering, Rights of the Moonbound. A record of the Vargar bloodline compact. Nora sat down on the floor. She opened it. The language was old. Not archaic exactly, not Latin or anything she couldn't parse, but formal, written in the register of someone recording laws rather than stories. She read slowly, turning pages with care. It was a genealogy, a record of something called the Compact, which appeared to be an agreement between, she needed to reread the section 3 times, between packs. Packs. The word was used without explanation, as though the reader was assumed to know what it meant. She kept reading. The compact was a binding between bloodlines and the moon, which was described not as an astronomical object but as something closer to a sovereign, a will with a name she couldn't quite render, something between the mother and the marking, and a third term she didn't have a translation for. Under the compact, each alpha of each bloodline was bound not only to their pack but to their fated pair. The term was used with a formality that made it feel like a legal designation, chosen at the moment of the moon's approval, sealed in a ritual called the Werewolf. She stopped on a specific passage. The fated pair is not selected by desire or proximity. It is selected by the ancestral bond, the deep recognition of compatible souls across bloodlines. When an alpha of the compact encounters their fated pair, the bond declares itself through 3 signs: the pull toward the other's presence regardless of circumstance, the scent mark, known to the alpha before logic has time to interfere, and the resonance, a sensation described variously as an echo, a completed chord, or the feeling of remembering someone you have not yet met. She read that last phrase again. The feeling of remembering someone you have not yet met. She thought of his eyes when she'd opened the door. She thought of there you are, the unbidden, wordless thought she'd had and immediately buried. She turned more pages, found a passage about rejection, about what happened when an alpha refused or denied the bond. The language here was colder, legalistic. Should an alpha deny the bond formally, whether through declaration, avoidance, or the willful suppression of the Werewolf seal, the bond does not dissolve, it transforms. The denied mate retains the right of counter-declaration, the ritual acceptance of rejection, spoken aloud before witnesses of the compact. This severs the mate's vulnerability to the bond's pull, restoring their autonomy. The alpha, however, remains bound. The bond does not release the alpha upon counter-declaration. It tightens. This is the ancient law, and it cannot be rewritten. She sat very still on the floor of the back room with the book in her lap. She could hear the front door opening, the sound of boots on the stone step, a slight pause, and then footsteps through the shop, reading her location with a precision that was, she understood now, not coincidence. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. He saw the book. Something moved across his face. Not shock, she thought, but something harder than shock. Something that looked like a man watching an outcome he had dreaded arrive exactly on schedule. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "The back room." She kept her voice even. "The sealed box. It was already here." "Nora Varger bloodline," she said. "Moon binding. Faded pears." She turned the book so he could see the page she'd stopped on. "Denial of the Varus seal." The silence that followed was absolute. He came into the room slowly, sat down across from her on an upturned crate, leaned forward, forearms on his knees, and looked at her in a way that stripped everything else out of the room. No context, no furniture, no distance, just the two of them and the words on the page between them. "How much did you read?" he asked. "Enough." She held his gaze. "You're an alpha of the compact. And you found me because..." She stalked. The word felt enormous in her mouth. "Because I'm yours, or I'm supposed to be." He didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He said quietly, "Yes." One word. She had learned that his single words carried the weight other people used entire conversations to carry. "And the rule you broke," she said, "that got you tracked." "I denied it," he said. "Formally. To my council. 3 months ago." His jaw was tight. "I told them the bond was wrong, that I wouldn't accept it, that you were outside the bloodline and it made no sense and I didn't." He stopped. "I had reasons. Tell me the reasons. I had a mate before," he said. "She died." The room went quiet in a different way. "Not through the bond," he said quickly, like he needed to clarify. "She died in an attack 2 years ago. I told myself I couldn't do it again, that the bond was pulling me towards something I wasn't capable of anymore." He looked at the floor. "I denied it, and then the tracker was sent, because denying the Varath before witnesses triggers the compact's enforcement clause." Nora sat with that. "So they're not punishing you," she said. "They're enforcing." "Yes, and the only way to end the enforcement is to accept the bond, or for you to declare counter-rejection." He looked up. "If you say the words, if you perform the counter-declaration before compact witnesses, the enforcement ends. I remain bound, but you are freed. The tracker stops. And you? I live with it." She looked at him for a long time. Outside the night was fully dark and the trees were silent, and somewhere down the hill the lights of the town made a pale smear against the cloud. Ordinary life, going about its business. "Why didn't you tell me this from the start?" she asked. "Because the moment I told you," he said slowly, "you would have to make a choice. And I..." He stopped again. She had begun to understand that his stops were not hesitation, they were precision. He stopped when the next word was not quite right, and waited for the one that was. "I didn't want you to choose before you knew me." She sat with that too. "That's either very considerate," she said, "or very manipulative." "I know," he said. "I haven't decided which myself." She looked at the book, then at him, then at the dark window. "You need to tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning, all of it." He nodded once, slow and deliberate as a promise. "Yes," he said, "I do." Chapter 5. Before the Thaw. He talked until midnight. Nora made tea and sat across from him and listened. And she was good at listening. It was the thing customers in the bookshop most often told her, surprised by it, as though they had expected a transaction and found instead that she was actually paying attention. She listened the way she read, completely, without rehearsing her response while someone else was still speaking. He told her about Varenholm. It was what he called the place. She did not immediately understand whether it was a town, a territory, or something less cartographically fixed, that the compact packs called home, nestled deep in the northern reaches of a forest that had no name on any public map. Governed by old law. 3 bloodlines, the Vargra compact, bound by the moon ritual that predated written history. Alphas were not elected or inherited. They were declared by the marking, a phenomenon that happened at the lunar convergence, once in a generation, when the moonlight touched a specific bloodline heir and the ancestral choice was made. Cassian had been marked at 22. He described it with a flatness that told her it had not been welcome. He had been the youngest in his family, the one no one expected it to fall to. and it had landed on him like a stone wall falling, and he had spent 4 years learning to carry it before he'd found Mara. He said her name once and then didn't say it again. Nora didn't ask him to. She understood that some names could only be spoken once in a sitting, and that pushing for more was the wrong kind of care. What she understood from the shape of what he didn't say, Mara had been warm where he was cold, had balanced something in him that the alpha's weight kept throwing sideways. When she died, rogue pack attack, 3 wolves acting outside the compact, a raid that should never have reached Varenholm. The balance went with her. He had spent 2 years since then in a kind of functional emptiness, doing the work of the alpha, maintaining the peace, keeping the laws, making sure no one else died, going through the motions of living with the efficiency of someone who had decided grief was an indulgence they couldn't afford. And then the moon bond had surfaced again. It doesn't usually happen twice, he said. He was looking at the fire rather than at her. A fated bond is supposed to be singular. Once in a lifetime, when the marking pointed to you, to a human, someone entirely outside the bloodline. My counsel assumed it was an error. Some contamination in the ritual. I assumed the same. You assumed, Nora said, or you wanted to assume? He was quiet for a moment. Both. She thought about that. She thought about a man standing in front of his council and declaring that the moon's choice was wrong, that he refused it, and what that must have taken. Not courage, exactly. Something more desperate than courage. What does the bond feel like? She asked. For you. He turned from the fire. The question seemed to cost him something. She could see it in the way he considered it, weighing each word. Like a direction, he said at last. Always knowing where you are. The way you know where the sun is even on an overcast day, you can't see it, but some part of you is oriented toward it regardless. He paused. And like sound, sometimes, the absence of static, as if everything else is noise and He stopped. Quiet, she said. Yes. He looked at her directly. Quiet. The word fell into the room and neither of them moved. She thought about the past 4 days. She thought about how she had stopped being afraid of him at some point she couldn't precisely identify. She thought about how she had slept better with him in the back room than she had in 3 years alone, and how she had chalked it up to exhaustion and known even as she did so that she was lying to herself. She thought about There You Are. The Bloodline Compact book, she said. It was here when I moved in. I assumed it came with the house, some relic from whoever lived here before. Who did live here before? She thought about it. The woman I bought from, Mrs. Howwin. She was old. She sold up and moved to her daughters. She paused. I never knew much about her. Cassian was very still. What was her first name? I don't. Nora stopped. She thought about the lease, the initial paperwork, the name she'd signed beneath. Verath, she said slowly. I thought it was unusual. Verath Howwin. He looked at her. The name, she now understood, was not a name from any ordinary naming tradition. She was a witness, he said, a compact elder, watchers, humans who carry the bloodline memory without the shift. They place themselves at nodes, at places where the bond might surface. He exhaled. She was here waiting, for you to arrive. Nora sat very still. How long ago did she leave? He asked. 3 months. She heard herself say it. She sold up 3 months ago, and 3 months ago I denied the bond formally, to my counsel. She watched the connection arrive on his face at the same moment it arrived on hers. The old woman had left at the moment of his rejection. Had moved out of the node, had removed her watch, either because she trusted whatever would come next, or because she knew the timeline was already in motion. She was setting the stage, Nora said. Yes, without asking me. No. He looked at her steadily. She wouldn't have. That's not how the compact works. It puts the pieces in place. It doesn't push. A pause. The choice is always yours. Nora stood up. She needed to move. The room had gotten very small suddenly, not with threat, but with implication, with the vertigo of understanding that the last 3 years of her life had been part of something she hadn't consented to. She went to the window and stood there looking at the dark. If I do the counter-declaration, she said, the rejection ritual, you said the tracker stops. Yes, and you're freed from the enforcement. From the enforcement, not from the bond itself. She turned. What does that mean? You'd still feel yes. For the rest of your life, yes. She looked at him. He sat by the fire, his expression entirely composed, and she understood that he had already accepted this. Had probably accepted it months ago, standing before his counsel, looking at the consequence he was choosing. That's a terrible thing to choose, she said. I wasn't asking for your pity. I know you weren't. She crossed her arms. I'm offering it anyway. Another not quite smile. Briefer than the last. She was beginning to collect them. She realized. Catalog them, the way she cataloged first editions, noting condition and rarity. I need time to think, she said. Of course. I'm not. She stopped. Chose her words. I'm not deciding tonight. I wouldn't want you to. She looked at him for a long moment in the firelight, this cold, careful, wounded man who had arrived bleeding on her doorstep and told her nothing and told her everything and was now waiting with perfect patience for her to decide whether to unmoor his life or let it stay. Bound to hers. Go to sleep, Cassian, she said. He stood. Moved toward the hall. Stopped in the doorway and didn't turn around. Thank you, he said, for the tea. It's just tea. I know, he said quietly. That's why I'm thanking you for it. Chapter 6. What Runs in the Blood. The tracker came on the 6th day. Nora knew something was wrong before she understood why. She was in the shop cataloging a new delivery when it hit her. Not a sound, not a sight. A smell. Pine resin and iron and something else underneath. Sharp and ancient, the way she imagined the inside of a struck flint might smell. Mineral and aggressive. She set the book down slowly. Cassian was through the connecting door to the cottage before she had time to move. Stay here, he said. What is? Stay here, his voice had changed. Still low, but strict of everything except urgency, a command that had weight to it, and she felt it land in her spine the way a sudden thunderclap does. Not with fear, but with the physical understanding that something dangerous was very close. Lock the door to the shop. Don't come out until I tell you. Cassian. He looked at her. She had looked at him many times in 6 days. But this was different. She had the unsteady thought that she was looking at two things at once. The man she had come to know, careful and quiet, and capable of small kindness. And something underneath him, something that ran deeper than personality, older and more dangerous, like seeing the bedrock beneath a field. Please, he said. She locked the door. She heard him leave through the back of the cottage. She heard nothing else for a long time. Then she heard sounds she didn't have language for. Movement heavy and fast through the trees, impacts that shook the earth slightly. A low resonant sound that she recognized from 3 nights ago and now understood was not a bear, had never been a bear. She stood with her back against the locked door and her heart slamming and her breath shallow, and she did not unbar the door. But she went to the window. She could see the edge of the forest from the shop's east window, the tree line where the land dropped away behind her cottage, the bare branches and the gray winter light. She pressed her hand to the cold glass and looked. She saw it for only a moment. 2 shapes, large and fast. Not wolves exactly, larger than wolves, built differently. The movement wrong in a specific way she couldn't describe except that it was more than an animal, purposeful in a way that carried consciousness. One silver gray, which she felt in her chest with a certainty she didn't question. One dark and heavier, and it hit the first with an impact she felt through the window glass. She pressed her palm flat against the pane. The dark shape had the other pinned for a moment. She saw the silver one go still, calculating, and then something happened that she had no framework for. A shift, almost too fast to track, from one form to another and back. A blur of motion in the gray light, and the dark shape twisted and fled into the trees. Fast. Retreating. Silence. Then Cassian, walking back across the yard in human form. His shirt gone, his shoulders marked with parallel lines of dark red. She unlocked the door. I told you to stay inside, he said, not unkindly. I looked through the window. She kept her voice steady by main force of will. I saw you. He stood in the doorway. The wounds on his shoulders were already beginning to close. She watched it happen and no longer pretended to be surprised by it. He looked at her steadily, reading her expression. You shifted, she said. Yes. I've read the word, but I didn't. She stopped. Started again. You're really, yes. He said it without apology and without drama. Simply, yes. This is what I am. I know this is. Stop apologizing, she said. He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment, at the wounds, at the composed face, at the steady silver eyes. She thought about everything she had read in the compact book. She thought about bloodline and moonbinding and fated pairs, about rituals performed under ancient light, about Werewolf Howen placing herself in a cottage for God knows how many years, and then leaving just in time. She thought about a man standing before his council and saying, "No, I won't do it again. I can't." She thought about grief, and she thought about the decision to refuse love as a form of armor. She thought about herself. "Come inside," she said. "I'll clean those." He came inside. She had become competent, she had discovered, at cleaning wounds. She had him sit at the kitchen table, and she worked with steady hands, and he was silent. And she was mostly silent, and there was a quality to the silence that was different from the comfortable kind they had built up over the past 6 days. This one had something live in it. Will it come back? She asked. Not alone. The tracker will return to the compact and report that I'm here and that the counter-declaration hasn't been made. They'll send enforcers next. When? 2 weeks. Maybe less. He paused. Once they come, the situation changes. There will be a formal compact hearing. You'll be asked to testify, whether you wish to invoke counter-declaration. The council will record it. It becomes law. He glanced at her. It's a different thing from what we've been doing here. It becomes formal. Nora pressed a cloth to the last wound. I want to see it, she said. Fahrenholm, I want to understand it before I decide. He went very still. That's not, he started. I know it's not simple. She set the cloth down. I know it's your home and your territory, and I know bringing me there is complicated. But I am being asked to make a decision that will affect the rest of your life and mine, and I am not going to do it based on what I've read in a book and what I've watched through a window. She looked at him. Take me there. He looked back at her. She had learned to read the layers in his expressions. What she was seeing now was not reluctance, but something closer to fear. Not fear of the place, not fear of the compact, fear of what would happen to her if she came, fear of what she would see, fear of what she would see, fear of what she might choose once she saw it. All right, he said. The word fell between them like a key. Chapter 7. The hall of the moonbound Fahrenholm was nothing like she had imagined. She had built it in her mind from the language of the compact book, formal, ceremonial, a place of old stone and older law. She had expected something austere. It was alive. They arrived at dawn, 3 days after Cassian had sent word ahead, approaching through a forest path that Nora would never have found alone, even with a map. The trees changed character as they went deeper. Older, taller, the undergrowth cleared away in a deliberate pattern that spoke of maintenance, of care. And then the path widened and the trees opened, and Fahrenholm was there, not a village exactly, not a compound, but something between. A gathering of structures built from timber and stone that had grown into each other over generations, connected by covered walkways, surrounded by gardens that were bare in winter but whose structure spoke of summer abundance. People looked up when they came through the gate. The looking was interesting. It was not unfriendly, not quite, but it was intent, assessing in a way she could feel against her skin, and she thought, they're scenting me. She thought, they're all like him. And the strangeness of it arrived and then, oddly, passed, because they also looked, undeniably, like people. They wore ordinary clothes and stood in ordinary postures, and one woman was hanging laundry on a line near the eastern building, and another was arguing with a teenage boy about something food-related, and the normalcy of those details grounded her. Cassian walked beside her, close but not touching. She was aware of him with a precision that 6 days in the cottage had made familiar. His pace, the slight shortening of his step to match hers, the angle of his attention. She was also aware, for the first time, of the way others responded to him. The assessment that had been directed at her shifted when it landed on him. Something in the collective posture of the people around them changed. A subtle and involuntary deference, like plants orienting toward sun. Not servile, not fearful, something more like gravity. He was the alpha, and this place knew it in its bones. And she thought, he carries this alone, this weight, this gravity, all these people and all this law and all this ancient responsibility. He had been carrying it since he was 22 and carrying it alone for 2 years since Mara. The council chamber was a circular room with a stone floor and a ceiling open at the center to the sky. It was cold. Benches ran around the walls and 8 elders sat on them. Women and men of various ages, watching her arrive with the same assessing attention as the people outside. At the head of the room, in a carved seat that was not quite a throne, sat a woman. She was perhaps 60, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of stillness that made Nora think of very deep water. She looked at Nora the way Cassian sometimes did, as if she was both new and already known. "Nora Vesper," the woman said. Her voice filled the circular space without effort. "I am Aldrin, first elder of the Varg Compact. You were invited to come here so that you might understand what you are being asked to choose." A pause. "This is not the formal hearing, this is a courtesy. Cassian asked for it." Nora glanced at him. He was standing just behind her left shoulder. He didn't look at her. "Thank you," she said. Aldrin looked at her for a long moment. "You are not afraid." "I'm very afraid," Nora said. "I'm good at not showing it." Something shifted on Aldrin's face. Not a smile exactly, more like a recognition. That is a useful quality in a mate of the alpha. She said it plainly, without sentiment or pressure. Just a fact being noted. "I haven't decided yet," Nora said, "whether to accept or reject. I know." Aldrin's eyes moved to Cassian. "He has told us. We respect the decision either way. The Compact's concern is not with the specific pair, it is with the observance of the law. If you invoke counter-declaration, the enforcement ends. The law is satisfied. Whatever Cassian chooses to carry afterward is his own matter." She looked back at Nora. "You owe him nothing. You owe him nothing. You owe us nothing. The bond was not your doing." "No," Nora said. "It wasn't." The elders were silent. Outside the open ceiling, the sky was winter white and a bird moved through it, small and dark. "What was the bloodline curse?" Nora asked. She had read about it in the book, mentioned in passing, unexplained. "The Varga Compact. It mentioned a curse in the original binding." The elders exchanged looks. "You read the rites," Aldrin said. "Yes. The curse is old," Aldrin said. "Older than the compact itself. A binding made by the founder of the Varga line in exchange for the moon's gift of the shift. A price." She paused. "The curse runs as follows. Any alpha who denies a true bond, not a mistake, not a premature recognition, but a true and confirmed Varath bond, will find the cost of that denial reflected back on their pack, not on themselves, on the people they protect." Nora went very still. She looked at Cassian. He was watching the floor. "You knew this," she said. "Yes," he said quietly. "You denied the bond knowing your pack would. I thought I could manage it." His jaw was tight. "I thought I told myself the curse was exaggerated, old lore, that it would be manageable." "And?" Aldrin answered. 3 people in this community have fallen ill since Cassian's formal rejection. An illness with no natural cause. Nothing serious yet, but the pattern is consistent with the early stage of the curse's working. Her voice was flat and unsparing. "We do not blame Nora Vesper. We do not pressure Cassian, but the counter-declaration resolves it entirely, and so does acceptance of the bond." Nora stood in the circular room with the open sky above her and felt the full weight of the situation land on her at last. Not the romance of it, not the strangeness of it, the actual weight, 3 people sick because of a decision made by a grieving man who thought he was protecting himself. A decision that had nothing to do with Nora and had pulled her into it anyway, and now the resolution ran through her whether she wanted it to or not. She turned to look at Cassian. He looked back at her. The expression on his face was the most open she had seen it. All the careful control stripped back. Just a man standing in his own failure, not asking to be forgiven, not defending himself, just present. "Why didn't you tell me about the curse?" she asked. "Because it would have felt like coercion," he said. Like I was using 3 sick people to pressure you into a bond you hadn't chosen. It does feel like that, she said. I know. He held her gaze. I'm sorry. Nora looked at the elders, at Aldrin, whose face had not changed, at the open sky. I need to walk, she said. Nobody stopped her. Chapter 8. The Thing She Hadn't Named. She walked for an hour. Varenholm had paths that led out from its edges into the forest, not wild but managed, marked with the same crescent symbols she'd seen on the map in the old book. She followed one of them without thinking, and it curved around the base of a low ridge and opened onto a clearing where a small lake sat still and silver in the winter light, its edges frozen and its center open, reflecting the white sky. She stood at the edge and looked at it. She thought about what she believed in. She had told herself for 3 years that she didn't believe in fate, and she'd been right about that, she thought. Fate was too passive a word for what she was looking at. Fate implied something that happened to you. What she was looking at was more like evidence, an accumulation of evidence that the world was built differently than she'd assumed, that there were laws underneath the visible ones, ancient and unconcerned with human convenience, and that those laws had an opinion about her. She thought about choice. The counter-declaration would free her. She would walk out of Varenholm with her autonomy restored, the bond dissolved from her end. The tracker stood down. She would go back to the cottage and the bookshop, and her small, deliberate life. Cassian would remain bound. 3 people would. Aldrin had said nothing serious yet. She held that word yet and felt the weight of it. She thought about what she had felt, standing in the kitchen on the second morning, when he'd handed her the coffee exactly right without asking. She thought about the not-quite smiles. She thought about a man who had stood before his council and refused love because he couldn't face losing it again, who had then followed an inexplicable pull through the rain and arrived bleeding on the doorstep of the exact woman he'd refused. She thought about the feeling of remembering someone you have not yet met. She thought about her own life, about the 3 years of grief that had brought her here, not from a lost partner, but from a lost self. A version of herself she'd misplaced somewhere in her mid-20s, a Nora who had believed the world was larger and stranger and more possible than she'd been finding it since. A Nora who had come to Ashford Creek to be quiet and stayed because quiet had become, somehow, the whole of what she expected. She thought about the morning the rain had brought him and how the room had felt different. Not safer exactly. Larger. Like a wall had quietly come down somewhere. She didn't believe in fate, but she thought she might believe in this. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps on the frozen path, slow and deliberate, giving her time to hear him coming. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, did not come in. I'm not going to try to persuade you, he said. I know, He stopped. The silence that followed was different from the choosing kind. This one had something raw in it, something he was holding carefully. I wanted to tell you, regardless of what you decide, that these 6 days were the first time in 2 years that I have felt. He stopped again, started again, that I have felt like a person rather than a function. She looked at the lake. That's not nothing, he said. I know it's not sufficient. I know it doesn't change what you're facing, but I wanted you to know it. She turned. He was standing at the clearing's edge in the winter light, and he was not performing composure. She could see the cost of it, the slight tension in his hands, the careful way he was breathing. He looked, she thought, the way people look when they have decided to be honest, with no expectation of a particular response. When honesty is the only thing they have left to offer, and they are offering it knowing it might not be enough. She walked toward him. She stopped a foot away, close enough to see the gray of his eyes, the faint lines at their corners, the scar that crossed his jaw that she had never asked about and might someday. I'm not doing this for the sick people, she said. I want that to be clear. He looked at her, said nothing. I'm not doing it because of the curse or the enforcement or the compact law. She held his gaze. I'm doing it because... She stopped. Chose the truest version of the words. I am doing it because I opened a door 6 days ago and I thought there you are, and I have been trying to argue myself out of what that means, and I am tired of arguing. He was very still. I'm not going to declare counter-rejection, she said. Something happened in his face. She watched it. A crack. Very small, in the carefully maintained surface. Something that might have been relief or might have been something much older and more desperate than relief. Nora, he said. But this is a beginning, she said. Not an ending. Not a done thing. I don't know you well enough, and you don't know me, and the moon doesn't get to skip that part. She looked at him steadily. I am willing to let the bond exist. I am willing to be here and to try to understand what this is, but I need you to choose me, Cassian. Not the bond. Me. With eyes open, I need you to decide you want this. Not because the compact requires it, not because the alternative is grief, but because you look at me and you want to know who I am. The clearing was very quiet. He looked at her. I already know I want to know who you are, he said. And there was nothing careful about it. It came out simply, like a thing that had been waiting to be said. I have wanted to know since you looked at me in your doorway and were not afraid. She let that settle. Okay, she said. Then we start there. He nodded. Once, the way he always nodded when something was decided, fully, without reservation. She turned and looked at the lake one last time. It was very still. In the center, where the ice didn't reach, the gray sky was reflected perfectly. And for just a moment, between one breath and the next, the clouds broke and the winter sun came through and the surface of the water blazed silver. She turned away from it and walked with him back toward Varenholm. Chapter 9. The Varath. The formal hearing was 3 days later. The elders convened at dawn in the circular chamber with its open ceiling. The pack assembled outside. Nora was aware of them through the walls, the collective presence of them, the gravity of an event the compact had not witnessed in a long time. An alpha reclaiming a bond previously denied, a human mate standing before the council. She was not afraid, she noted this. She had been afraid at various points over the past 10 days, when the tracker had moved through the trees, when she'd read the passage about the curse, when she'd stood in the clearing and understood the full dimensions of what she was choosing. But standing here in the stone room in the winter dawn, she found herself simply present. Clear, the way she felt sometimes at the start of a very long and difficult book, when the scale of it was finally visible and she had already decided she was going to read every page. Cassian stood beside her. He had not touched her. There had been no great declaration, no conventional romance, nothing that would fit the pattern of the word mate as she had previously understood it. What had happened instead was quieter and, she was beginning to think, considerably more real conversations until midnight, shared silences that had weight. The particular trust that builds between people who have watched each other face difficult things and not looked away. She looked at him now. He looked back. His expression was the open version. The one she'd come to know meant I am choosing to be honest right now. Not calm. Honest. Ready? He said. Yes, she said. Aldrin stood at the head of the chamber. The other elders were arranged in a semicircle. The first elder held a shallow bowl of water in which something dark floated. Not blood, Nora thought, or not only blood, something deeper and more fundamental. The same color as the dark crystallized substance she'd found in the sealed box. The ceremony was not long. Aldrin spoke in the old formal register of the compact book. Words Nora could mostly follow, having read the relevant sections 3 times that morning. She heard the terms clearly: Varath seal, acknowledged by Alpha and Mate, witnessed before the moon-bound elders, entered in the record of the compact. She heard Cassian's name spoken in full for the first time. Cassian Avar Varg. She heard her own name in the formal phrasing. Nora Vesper, of no bloodline, named by the moon's own choosing, which recognizes no lineage but the soul's. She had cried quietly and privately, reading that line the night before. She did not cry now. When Aldrin asked for the acknowledgement, Cassian spoke first. His voice was steady and absolutely clear, and nothing about it was performance. I acknowledge the bond, he said. I acknowledge what I refused and why I refused it. I do not ask the moon to excuse the refusal, only to accept the acknowledgement now. I choose this. A slight pause. I choose her. Nora heard it in her chest, not metaphorically, not as an emotional description of sentiment, but literally a physical resonance, a frequency she didn't have a word for, as though a string had been struck that ran all the way through her. She understood now what the book had meant by completed chord. Aldrin looked at her. Nora took a breath. I acknowledge the bond, she said. I don't fully understand it yet. I expect I'll spend a long time learning it. But I acknowledge that it exists, and I acknowledge him. She paused. I choose to be known. A silence. Long, resonant. Then something changed in the room. She didn't have the framework to describe it properly. A shift in pressure, perhaps. The way the atmosphere changes before lightning. A charging of the air. A sense of something vast paying attention. The bowl of water in Aldrin's hands went still as a mirror, and then the surface rippled without being touched. The elders bowed their heads. Cassian exhaled. It was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen him do. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the simple physical release of a breath held too long. She looked at his profile and saw, for the first time, what he looked like without the weight of the refusal on him. The lines around his eyes didn't change. He didn't look younger. He just looked unencumbered. Like a man who had set down something very heavy and was learning what it felt like to stand straight. She took his hand. She had not planned to. It was not a dramatic gesture. She simply reached out and took his hand the way you might take the arm of someone walking in the dark, because it seemed like the useful thing to do. He looked down at their hands and then up at her, and she thought she saw, for just a moment, the full weight of everything he was. Grief and duty and the 2 years of carrying it alone, and, underneath all of that, something she didn't have a word for yet, but thought she might eventually. His hand closed around hers. Outside, through the stone walls, she heard the assembled pack. Not a roar, not a shout. A sound she hadn't heard before and couldn't quite describe. Something between breath and voice, collective and deep. The sound a force might make if they could express relief. The bond is sealed, Aldrin said. The enforcement is withdrawn. The curse is lifted. The record is entered. She looked at them both with an expression that was not soft and not cold. Simply true. Welcome to the compact, Nora Vesper. Nora stood in the winter dawn holding the hand of an alpha king who had refused her and been brought back, and was now looking at her with that careful, honest, silver gaze. Thank you, she said. To the room, to the elders. To him. His hand tightened slightly. She didn't let go. Chapter 10. What follows a storm. The robes came 3 days after the ceremony. She should have been surprised. She wasn't. Cassian had warned her, in the quiet days following the Werewolf, that the formal acknowledgement of the bond would carry to the rogue packs, the ones that operated outside the compact, the ones who had been watching the enforcement and calculating the vulnerability. An alpha in a weakened state, a new mate with no bloodline power, a pack that had been managing a curse. These things looked, from the outside, like opportunity. 7 of them, by Cassian's count, coming through the northern tree line before dawn. Nora heard the alarm, not a siren, not a bell, but a sound passed voice to voice through the sleeping settlement, low and urgent. The communication she'd heard that first night in Ashwood Creek, and now understood. She was out of bed and dressed before the second wave of it reached her window. Cassian was already at the door. You are not coming, he said. I know, she said. I know, she said. What do I do? He looked at her. This was one of the things she had learned to love about him. Not that word yet, not aloud, but she kept finding herself in the vicinity of it, that he did not waste time arguing the obvious. She had said, I know. He believed her. The elders are moving the younger pack members to the lower hall, he said. Go with them. Aldrin will be there. Stay close to her. He paused. She'll keep you safe and you'll keep her company. She's not as unaffected by this kind of thing as she appears. I can believe that, Nora said. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he crossed the distance between them, 3 steps, deliberate, and kissed her. Not tentatively, not with reservation, with the decisiveness of a man who had learned that hesitation costs more than the risk. His hand came up and cupped the side of her face, and she felt the bond flare in her chest, bright and certain, and she kissed him back with equal directness and equal lack of reservation. It was brief. Come back, she said. Yes, he said. No hesitation. He left. She stood in the doorway for 3 seconds, and then went to find Aldrin. The lower hall was stone and deep, lit by oil lamps that cast a warm amber light across 24 people sitting in varying states of anxiety. Children, elderly pack members, 2 people who had been among the 3 sick and were now recovered. She noted that with relief, young adults who were clearly fighting the instinct to be above ground and running. Aldrin was in a chair near the lamp, her hands folded in her lap, her expression the same as always, deep water, unruffled. Nora sat beside her. "How often does this happen?" she asked. "Less than it used to," Aldrin said. "The compact has held its borders well for 40 years. Rogues probe occasionally, they rarely come in force." She paused. 7 is more than a probe. They think we're weak. They thought we were weak. They have poor information. They don't know the bond was sealed. She looked at Nora. They expected to find an alpha in a fractured state and a disputed territory. What they've found is something rather different. From above, muffled by stone but not completely hidden, Nora heard the sounds of the fight. She focused on breathing. She focused on the lamp's amber light, on the faces around her, on the small girl 2 seats down who had fallen back asleep against her mother's shoulder with a specific faith in safety that Nora found, unexpectedly, both unbearable and bracing. That's what this is for, she thought. All of it, the bond, the law, the ceremony, the cost, for this, for her. The sounds above shifted, changed quality, and then stopped. The silence had a different character than the before silence. It had shape. Then, footsteps on the stairs. Multiple, the stride she recognized above all others. And Nora was on her feet before she'd made the decision to stand. He was bleeding from one shoulder and not concerned about it. 7 are down, he said. He was speaking to the room, but his eyes found her immediately, before anything else. 3 subdued, 4 fled, no pack casualties. The room released a sound of collective relief. He walked to her. She looked at the wound. "That's new. It'll close. I know it will." She put her hand on his chest. Not the wound, not a diagnostic gesture, just her palm flat against his sternum. Feeling his heart, he covered her hand with his. Predictably inconvenient timing. Robes typically are. Are they gone? Properly? For now, they'll think twice before approaching again. He looked down at her hand on his chest. "Aldrin." She was excellent company, Nora said. "She told me the story about the moon convergence in 1987 while the pack fought for our lives. It was genuinely riveting." From across the hall, Aldrin made a sound that might, from another person, have been a laugh. The amber lamps were warm. The younger pack members were beginning to surface, back toward their ordinary lives, voices returning to normal pitch. The small girl had woken up and was complaining about being hungry, and her mother was negotiating on volume. And Nora stood in the middle of all of it, with her hand on an alpha's heartbeat, and felt the shape of what her life had become. It was large. Not large in the way she'd feared. Not overwhelming. Not consuming. Large in the way a window is large when you open it and realize the room has been smaller than the view. Large in the way she had been looking for, before grief had made her stop looking. "Cassian," she said. He looked down at her. "I'm glad you followed the pull," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with that careful precision he brought to every word that mattered, "So am I." Chapter 11. Nora in the spring came late to Werewolf. That was one of the things she learned about the deep forest, that the seasons arrived on their own schedule, indifferent to the calendar, and spring here meant something different than spring in Ashford Creek. It came as a slow brightening, a daily increment of warmth and light. The ice on the lake thawing from the edges inward over the course of 2 weeks until the surface was open water again, and the birds that had been absent for months arrived and began making their case. For territory, Nora had spent the winter between 2 places. She had not given up the cottage or the bookshop. This had been important to her, and Cassian had understood it without being asked to, had understood it in the way he was learning to understand things about her, which was with attention rather than assumption. The cottage was hers, the bookshop was hers. On the days she was there, she worked and read and kept her friendships with Villa and Marcus, who had accepted the story of a partner who lived some distance away with the particular curiosity of people who had always known Nora was not entirely ordinary. But she spent 3 days a week in Werewolf, and then 4. And then, without precisely deciding, most of them. She was learning the pack. This was both stranger and more natural than she had expected. The people of Werewolf were not a different species, not incomprehensible. They argued about food and complained about cold and had complicated feelings about their extended family members and told stories at dinner that went too long. They were also things she had no word for, carried a wildness that was part of their nature rather than against it, read the world through sense and instinct in a way she was only beginning to understand. They received her with a directness she had come to appreciate. No pretense, no performance. Compact folk didn't seem to have the social habit of obscuring what they meant. She thought she might be, slowly, losing the habit herself. The compact book was still in her back room. She had read it 3 times now and discussed sections of it with Aldrin in the evenings by the fire. Aldrin was, it turned out, exactly the kind of person Nora had been missing without knowing she was missing, brilliant and unsparing and willing to be argued with a dry wit she rationed like expensive tea. The 3 sick pack members had fully recovered the week after the Verith. Nora had felt something about that, something complicated, the knowledge that her choice had had material consequence, that it had meant something immediate and physical to people she hadn't known when she'd made it. She sat with that knowledge. She did not feel crushed by it, and she did not feel heroic about it. She felt that the world had taken her seriously. She found she wanted to be worthy of that. On an evening in late March, she was in the clearing by the lake. It was her place now. She had claimed it in the way you claim a place without asking permission, by returning to it often enough that the land begins to expect you. The ice was gone. The water was that shade of particular spring gray blue that reminded her of the inside of mussels. Cassian came and sat beside her on the flat rock at the water's edge. He had been in a council meeting all afternoon. She could tell by the slight tension around his eyes, the way he held his shoulders. She was learning his lexicon, all the small signs. She was also learning, more slowly, when to ask and when to simply be present. This felt like the second kind. They sat in the spring evening in comfortable silence. It was the kind of silence they had been building since October, added to daily and small increments, an architecture of shared quiet that was now as specific to them as a language. Aldrin wants to formally enter your name in the compact record, he said eventually. As a full member, not just as the Alpha's mate, as a member in your own right, able to vote in council. Nora looked at the water. Is that unusual? There's no precedent for it. He glanced at her, but Aldrin is of the opinion that precedents should be made by doing things, not by waiting for permission. I like her very much. I know. Something in his voice that was warm with the particular warmth she had come to love in him. Understated, placed carefully, genuine all the way through. She likes you. She told me you were, in her words, the kind of person who improves a room by disagreeing with it. Nora laughed. Really laughed. The kind that comes up without warning and sits bright in the chest for a moment, before settling. He watched her laugh with the expression she had catalogued the most over the winter. Not the almost smiles, which were frequent now, which she hoarded a little less desperately as they accumulated. Something else. The look he had when he was watching her be fully herself and finding each time that it was exactly what he wanted to be watching. What do you want? He asked. She knew he didn't mean the compact record. He asked her this with some regularity now, not as an offer to deliver it, but as a genuine question, as the question he had perhaps not asked anyone in 2 years and was learning to ask again. More of this, she said. She meant the evening. She meant the lake and the spring and the particular weight of him beside her. She meant Varenholm and the cottage and Aldrin by the fire and the slow expanding knowledge of what her life could hold. Whatever this is becoming, it's becoming yours, he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with those silver eyes, unhidden. The cold all the way gone. Not replaced by warmth, but become warmth. Transformed over months of small mornings and difficult evenings into something she would have had no name for in October, but had a name for now, ours. She said. He nodded. Once. Slowly. The way he nodded when something was true. The lake was very still. The evening settled around them, spring and patient. And somewhere in the deep forest a bird she didn't recognize sang something uninterrupted and clear, and the trees held it. And the water held it, and Nora held it too, the strange, real, possible life, and did not let it go.